Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Carrie Smith, and it's my pleasure and honor to present to you the defense's opening statement on behalf of Mr. Lester Ralph Jones. Law enforcement's investigation in this case is sick. It is infected with the virus of making the facts what they want them to be. What are the symptoms of the infection that has plagued Mesa County Sheriff's Office investigation in this case and put the wrong man in the defendant's seat? The first is making mistakes and taking missteps. The second is tunnel vision. The third is taking a close enough is good enough approach. The fourth is asserting theories that don't hold up. And the final is letting the real killer get away. How do we know this investigation is infected? How do we know that the sheriff's office let the real killer get away in this case? Because you will hear about the weight of the investigative resources that they put into this case against Mr. Jones. Forensic testing of hundreds of items, hundreds of hours of interviews, countless searches, numerous dog sniff tracks, hundreds of pages of phone records, and you will see how light the evidence is, how little the sheriff's office has to show for it, how there is an absence of evidence against Mr. Jones. We know this is an infected investigation because the amount of resources poured into investigating Mr. Jones would have resulted in actual evidence if he were the real perpetrator. If Mr. Jones had done this crime, you would hear and see a lot more evidence in this trial than you will. The prosecution would have a lot more to show you. The absence of evidence against Mr. Jones means Mr. Jones is innocent. The first symptom of this infected investigation, mistakes and missteps. The mistakes and missteps in this investigation begin when Ms. Beverly Jarrell was assigned as the lead investigator on this case the day after Ms. Bergfeld's car was set on fire in 2007. Ms. Jarrell, the lead investigator in this case, was eventually removed from the case in January of 2011 when investigator Havenstreit took it over. She ended her tenure at the sheriff's office in March of 2014 with receiving a major disciplinary action for her work on this case. You'll hear from this woman, who was the lead investigator on this case for the first 3.5 years. You will hear that she remembers very little about her work on this case. You'll hear that without a strong chain of command, her sergeant was very busy assigning tasks and conducting investigation without her knowledge. And you will hear that this woman, the lead investigator, lost evidence in this case. Finally, you will hear that when former investigator Jarrell walked off the job in 2014, other investigators found evidence from this case strewn about her office. This was over 3 years after investigator Havenstreit had taken the case over. And this was evidence that was obviously never booked in, properly stored, or maintained for 7 years. And this was despite the lieutenant, her superior's superior, requesting that all investigators look through their office to make sure that they did not have evidence from the Paige Bergfeld case misplaced in their offices, because it was clear that evidence was lost and had gone missing. And so the lieutenant requested that people search their offices. And investigator Jarrell either did and didn't see it, or just didn't follow her lieutenant's command, and evidence was found in her office after she walked off the job. Another mistaken misstep, evidence that just was never collected. In addition to hearing about evidence that the sheriff's office lost throughout this case, you're going to hear about a lot of evidence that they just left behind. Evidence that you will not get to see or analyze for yourself because the investigators simply chose not to collect it. Here's the real killer. It could have landed the right man at the defendant's table, but instead, investigators just left those door handles behind. Another example of evidence never collected. the gas can at Bob Scott's RV. Not only did investigators not collect this gas can, they didn't even photograph it that well, as you can see from these pictures. You're not even going to get a much better view of this infamous gas can than you get right here. Not only did they not photograph it well, they didn't collect it, they didn't open it, they didn't smell it, they didn't look inside it. Hey, we think this might be the gas can that torched Ms. Bergfeld's car. We think her car was torched with a gasoline accelerant. Why don't we take a sniff in this gas can and see if that matches up? Oh no, not necessary for the Mesa County Sheriff's Office. The way that the investigators will talk about this gas can, right, they will talk about it like it's tantamount to the murder weapon in this case. They think it's the gas can that Mr. Jones used to burn Ms. Bergfeld's car. But for the sheriff's office, it was good enough just to snap a few pictures of it from a distance amongst this clutter here. And it's good enough for the sheriff's office just to tell you, look, this is the gas can that Mr. Jones used, with nothing more to present to you. You're also going to hear about additional evidence that the sheriff's office investigators just never obtained. One of the very first suspects in this case was Mr. Bergfeld's ex-husband, Rob Dixon, as ex-husbands often are, right? The first people that maybe will get looked at in a case like this. And you will hear how important phone records were in this case, right? All of the phone records they collected from all of the people who had contact with Ms. Bergfeld the day she went missing and even before. In accordance with getting phone records, they got phone records for one of Mr. Dixon's phones, the phone that shows that he's in Pennsylvania. But Mr. Dixon had two cell phones, and the sheriff's office knew this. And they knew this because his daughter, their eldest daughter, Jess Dixon, who you'll hear from in this trial, when she reported her mother missing on June 30th, she gave investigators her father's cell phone number. This is how you can get in touch with my dad. But the sheriff's office didn't get the records for that phone number. They only got the records for his other phone number. It was good enough for the sheriff's office to get the records for just one of Mr. Dixon's cell phones in an investigation that relied so heavily on cell phone data to rule out suspects and target Mr. Jones. You're going to hear about evidence that the sheriff's office lost. This is evidence they once had, they bothered to collect and obtain, and then went ahead and lost it. This is Mr. Jose Tavera. You will hear quite a bit about him in this trial. He's the best friend of one of the very first lead suspects, George Coraluzzo. Numerous investigators will tell you how critical those first few hours are in an investigation, before stories change, before witnesses collaborate and try to get their stories together, before memories fade, before evidence dissipates. And no one demonstrates the importance of this fundamental investigation tenet as a man who every time he makes statements in this case changes his story, and that's Mr. Tavera. And we will never know what Mr. Tavera told investigators in the first few days of this investigation. It was July 4th of 2007, 6 days after Ms. Bergfeld went missing. Investigators interviewed this man, and they lose that interview. And this is just one example of evidence lost in this case. There is even more evidence that completely vanishes. First of all, in regard to Mr. Coraluzzo, the man on the right, he was a very early on lead suspect in this case. The sheriff's office, in addition to interviewing Mr. Tavera, his best friend, interviewed several witnesses who knew this man in the first few days of the investigation. Those interviews are lost forever. There was an interview and a recording of a witness who wore a wire after the sheriff's office got an important lead in 2009. All of that information about the interviews and the recording from this woman who wore a wire, gone. In the middle there's Mr. Stephen Heald. He was a suspect in this case. Law enforcement interview Mr. Heald's boss and brother in the early days of the investigation, similar to Mr. Tavera. Those interviews, gone. And an interview that Investigator Gerald conducted with Rob Dixon on July 2nd, 2007, as he supposedly arrives in town. This is the first contact that the lead investigator has with Mr. Dixon. Gone. You will hear about other problems in this case as well. You will hear that investigators and deputies failed to write reports for numerous interviews, even though report writing is a basic law enforcement task. And you will see in this investigation, right, that has spanned 9.5 years for an incident that occurred over 9 years ago, how critical report writing is, right? Because memories fade, and law enforcement personnel are expected to document what they learn, so that if a case goes to trial 9.5 years later, we have something to refresh our memories with. In this case, you will hear about reports never being written. Mesa County Sheriff's Office also did not follow up on several leads that came in. Of course, these are leads, you will hear, that did not point to Mr. Jones. These leads pointed to someone else, and they're gone. You will also hear about last-minute investigative attempts to drum up evidence, even in the weeks right before this very trial. 9 years after the investigation began, and the Sheriff's Office set their unrelenting sights on Mr. Jones. Now, the DA will try to suggest to you that on one hand, all of these problems, lost evidence, missing investigation, they don't matter. All these flaws in their investigation don't matter because the lost and missing evidence doesn't support their theory that Mr. Jones is the perpetrator. This evidence doesn't matter, the district attorney will try to suggest to you, because it is evidence that would have weakened and decayed their unrelenting tunnel vision on Mr. Jones. The DA will also try to suggest to you that, on the other hand, Investigator Habenstreit was able to go back and fix everything. He was able to re-interview people, replace evidence that was missing, recreate evidence that was lost. But by the time Investigator Habenstreit gets this case in January of 2011, it was too late, right? That's 3.5 years later. Too much evidence had been lost, too many leads left to evaporate. Memories fade, and people disappear. And it's simply too hard to know what you don't know. And keep in mind that the missing, lost, uncollected, and undocumented evidence you will hear about in this trial is just what we know about. It's hard, if not impossible, to know something is lost when you never knew it existed in the first place. So what else was lost, not collected, not documented, not followed up on, that could have exonerated Mr. Jones and proved who the real killer is? The second symptom, close enough is good enough. So even though what you will hear in this trial, what you will see in this trial, is that investigators, the way that investigators conducted this investigation, it can be characterized as a close enough is good enough approach. And so at the end of the trial, even though the investigators and law enforcement did not do their job diligently and thoroughly, they will still be asking you on a flimsy investigation to convict Mr. Jones. So instead of coming to you with all the evidence they could collect, all the hard-hitting investigation they could do to thoroughly rule out other suspects, you will hear how investigators were careless and unambitious and too often just thought, close enough, that's good enough. So what do I mean by this? Let me illustrate with a few examples that you will hear about. This is Mr. Livingston. This is the man that Ms. Bergfeld was to meet on Thursday, June 28th in room 247 at the Motel 6. So this is one of the men that she calls where bedding gets washed. We know, too, Mr. Livingston will tell you that he wasn't in this room in the days preceding July 3rd, that he was in it June 28th, not in it, and then in it again on July 3rd when they collect the bedding. So there's this gap in time when the bedding is laundered. But that's good enough for the sheriff's office to test and to collect and test bedding that is 5 days old. Here's another example. You're going to hear about a light-colored sedan driving around the parking lot where Ms. Bergfeld's Models, Inc. office was. You're going to hear that this sedan was driving around this parking lot the Monday before she went missing. And the DA is going to try to convince you that that's Mr. Jones driving around her parking lot. This is how he's going to do it. First, you're going to see some surveillance, some blurry surveillance of a light-colored sedan. Then you're going to see a picture of Mr. Jones' Impala, okay, that law enforcement seized. And there, the DA is going to try to convince you that because these sedans are similar shape and hue, it's the same car. I think Mr. Waite used the word identical. But turns out that there were many other similar light-colored sedans manufactured and on the road in 2007, like a Chevy Caprice, or a Ford Taurus, or a Cadillac Seville, or a Chevy Malibu. And you're not going to hear any attempts to examine or enhance that blurry footage to really compare it to any other car and make sure that it is identical to an Impala. Just a blurry light-colored sedan the district attorney wants you to assume is Mr. Jones's silver Impala, because in this investigation, close enough is good enough. Let me give you another example. The DA may offer testimony about a blade of grass, literally a blade of grass, found in the undercarriage of Ms. Bergfeld's car. And then without more, he's going to suggest that this blade of grass got there from driving in Wells Gulch. No other testimony is going to match this blade of grass with Wells Gulch. The sheriff's office and the DA will suggest that because there's grass at Wells Gulch, if a car has a blade of grass underneath the car, it must mean the car was driven in Wells Gulch. Close enough is good enough. So when this is